We're live.
Welcome to the Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Becky Scher.
And I'm Michael Brodkorb.
And we are here with an extra special podcast today. We are coming to you live this morning to discuss the second Republican presidential debate. We are so grateful for those of you joining us while we venture into yet another live debate or live podcast. And for those of you joining after the fact, we appreciate you too. Today we have three incredible panelists joining us. Again, we figured who better to help us analyze the second debate than those same folks who helped us break down the first debate. So let's start by welcoming back to the podcast Representative Walter Hudson. Hudson is in his first term in the Minnesota House and represents the Albertville, Otsego, and St. Michael area. Next is GOP strategist, operative, and good friend, John Rouleau. John has long been active in Republican politics, currently serving as the executive director of the Minnesota Jobs Coalition. It is also his birthday. And our third panelist is a pro in the Republican messaging and communications world, Preya Samsundar. Preya has worked for the MNGOP and the RNC. And again, for full disclosure, Preya is currently working with the Nikki Haley presidential super PAC. We are a bit more well rested today and have had a little bit more time to analyze and assess what we watched last night. So we are ready to break down the second debate. As you listen, head over to our website at bbreakpod.com or on X, Twitter, at bbreakpod, and let us know what you thought of the debate and our analysis. Thanks again for joining us and enjoy the show. So we are going to start with a very similar format to what we had last time around. We're going to do a quick round robin, brief introduction for anybody who maybe didn't catch the last debate panel, and then give us initial 1-2 minutes on the general debate overview. We'll start with Representative Hudson.
Thanks for once again having me as a part of this panel to discuss the second GOP presidential primary debate. There's an old adage, and Michael's probably familiar with this, having had some experience in the journalistic field, that you really shouldn't make yourself the story, and as the reporter, as the journalist. And I really felt as though way too much attention was placed on the production itself rather than the candidates. I was very disappointed by how much this resembled a reality TV show or a game show or a third grade playground fight, as opposed to an actual substantive policy debate. There were moments, and we'll get to those, but my initial impression was, boy, what a missed opportunity to have a substantive policy debate at a time when that moment is called for.
John.
And thanks for having us back on. Looking forward to talking about the debate and what we saw. But I've got to agree with Representative Hudson. My biggest takeaway from last night was what an absolute failure and a miss from Fox News. They had an opportunity to showcase some candidates, talk about policies and positions. And the more that I kind of thought about it and watched it, I think that it's a format problem, right? And it ended up hindering the candidates in that, as they were going through, it was almost like the hosts were trying to debate the candidates themselves. So everybody was getting different questions, which I think was an awkward format for the candidates up there, because they wanted to engage with one another, they wanted to debate one another. But by the time that they ask one question, then it bounces to another candidate with a completely different question. So they're trying to sort of shoehorn a response to the person who just spoke into another answer about a question that they were just asked. But I think the panelists lost control of the debate, and the format itself, I think, was really a hindrance. But that's my big takeaway, is just what an absolute missed opportunity for Fox.
Agreed. Preya.
So I've got two takeaways from the debate last night. So agree with Walter and John on the fact that, this was just a huge swing and miss for Fox News. Just right out of the gate, when Varney kind of botched the introduction there, I had an inkling where I was like, oh, this is just not going to go well. And sure enough, it didn't. Fox, for all of, its efforts, they did not have control of the debate stage. This should have been expected after the first debate, where a lot of folks didn't have airtime. This really is, the start of crunch time for a lot of these candidates, where donors are starting to take a look to see, okay, where's my money best invested in? If we're going to take on Donald Trump in the Iowa caucuses and New Hampshire primary, where's my money best spent? This is an opportunity for voters to take a harder look and make that decision to further finalize their decision-making process. And it should have been expected that some of these guys were going to want to get on that stage and try to insert themselves, especially since the first debate was, largely forgettable for a lot of the candidates on that stage. And so to not be prepared to cut mics and to, ensure that this debate ran smoothly, I think that was just a huge hit and miss for Fox News. Really surprised because I do love the moderators on that stage, so it was just very disappointing to see them just not have control of the debate. But on the second point as well, I think if we're looking at overall, I think it was just another good night for Nikki Haley. I think she just continued to show that she had command of the stage, command of the issues, and it was something that I frankly expected to see. Mind you, being her super PAC here and being a supporter, but I think her answers just further set her apart from everybody else on that debate stage amid all of the squabbles and the fighting.
Michael, your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for joining again, and Becky for leading this discussion today. I'm going to agree with what everyone said prior to me about the format first. I'm surprised in 2023, after the number of presidential debates that have been televised, that we can't come up with a better, more structured format for these debates. I said it the last time that we did this post-debate analysis, that I thought the format of having that many candidates on the stage is challenging. And I know what the role of the party, particularly at the national level, is to support the candidates and provide a platform and a stage for all of the candidates in the race to get some exposure so the public can engage and get some interest in the various campaigns. I just think that they need to cut off some of these candidates more. I think there needs to be a higher threshold for candidates to be on the stage. That, I think, would allow for, I don't know if you can do in essence, a JV squad, then varsity, because that gets challenging. Then you're picking winners or losers. But I think they need, going forward into future debates, I think they need to be structured in a way where there's fewer candidates. That allows for more contrast. I think more discussion on the issues, which is ultimately what I think the Republican candidates need to be focused on. And it just got out of control very, very quickly. And that's unfortunate. And I think if there were fewer candidates on the stage, they would be more focused on substance, presentation, and it would be an overall better platform for the Republican Party at the national level to showcase candidates. That being said, I do want to say that I think Nikki Haley did a fantastic job, and I think she was the clear winner of last night's debate. Although, again, Donald Trump wasn't on the stage, and so I'll finish my remarks and again by saying thank you to all you guys for participating, everyone for participating. I really appreciate it.
Just to concur with everybody else, I do think the format is just troubling. I don't love the not all of the panelists get the same questions. Like, for one example, I did feel for Burgum when he didn't get an answer on an energy question, which is something that's very hot topic in his state right now. And I just think that it then detracted when that person did get speaking time. Then they went back, answered that question, the 60-second for answers, and then 30-second rebuttal too. It's just, if I was creating these debates, I think they should be issue focused. We should have one that's on the economy. We should have one that's on, foreign affairs. We should have one that's on social issues or whatever it might be. But I just want to also throw out, like I did last time, the discrepancies between those who spoke the most and the least. DeSantis spoke for 12 and a half minutes total. Burgum was the least with 7.5 minutes. And surprisingly, Haley she was second to least amount of minutes with 9. And did have a strong performance. But when I think of what these debates are supposed to be is really relaying where Republican candidates stand on the issues. And then when we look down this New York Times, also where they have the speaking minutes, they also have a layout of the subjects that were spoken or the issues that were discussed the most. Border security came in top with 5.5. National security is down at 115. But one that was really surprising to me, and not that Republicans love to talk about it, but one that I do think is going to be important, and we don't need to get into the issue. I'm just stating the fact that abortion was spoken about for 1 minute and 5 seconds in a 2-hour debate of something that is so monumental for a lot of voters right now. I think there was a lot of missed opportunities from candidates not being able to relay good messaging or even having that time to answer in general. So concur with it all. I think it needs to be more focused. It was just at times I really wanted to cover my ears because there was so much chaos that it was really tough to listen to. And I say that as a mother of a 14-month-old who there is music and chaos in my house at all times. So with that, we're going to go around again. Last time we focused on winners and losers. Today, we're going to turn our attention to, since it is the second debate, there is more time since the last one in just both debate world and general presidential politics. Want to talk about who, if anyone, gained ground in the second debate that maybe in your debate view or presidential view, obviously, aside from, Donald Trump being the front runner still, if anybody on that debate stage gained ground from their performance last night. John, we'll start with you.
So, yeah, as I kind of watched the debate, one thing that jumped out to me is that Tim Scott, I think, clearly has the award for most improved performance. Last debate, I kind of forgot that he was on the stage a lot of times. He seemed uncomfortable. He seemed like he was kind of trying to get some canned responses. Last night, he seems like he settled into kind of his voice and found that a little bit. I thought that he gave a couple of memorable responses. So I think Tim Scott got most improved. I think Ron DeSantis had a much better night than he did last debate. I think that he also kind of seems to have settled in, kind of found his voice a little bit and got more comfortable. And I think it'll be interesting to see where anybody goes from that. Vivek, I think, also had a better night. And one of the things that really jumped out to me was how he did a complete 180 on how he was trying to engage and interact with the other candidates on that stage. He went from calling them all bought and paid for and frauds in the first debate to now saying that he respects all of them and they're great people. He tried to kind of walk back and say, I'm not a know-it-all. I'm not, this cocky young kid. So clearly his team, I think, has seen that what he did last time was not really what was going to resonate with the voters. And I think it'll be interesting to see if he's able to kind of continue that switch, or if he's going to get branded as just, this is another flip-flop that's come from him, which I think is something that, people are rightly accusing him of, where he's kind of been on a lot of on both sides of a lot of issues multiple times. But I thought that his performance last night was a little bit less jarring, a little bit less obnoxious. And I think those are the three who I saw who did better last night than they had the first time.
Preya, your thoughts?
So I think if we're talking about overall performance, obviously I think, again, biased here, but Nikki Haley did have the better night out of everyone on that stage. Not, as you kind of pointed out, she was second to last when it came to minutes talking on that debate stage. But time and time again, when she did have the opportunity to have the mic, to have a substantive debate and talk about the issues, she came ready with a plan. She was very coherent in her arguments, and she wasn't afraid to push back and stand her ground on some of the attacks that were thrown her way. It was very clear, I think, last night that folks saw Nikki Haley as the candidate to beat. And so you saw Tim Scott take the first swing that frankly his campaign has made against her the entire cycle. mind you, I don't think that debate that hit landed the way that he thought it would. And I think the same thing with, DeSantis. He tried to, hit her a little bit. That didn't land as well. Meanwhile, on the flip side, like, Nikki Haley had substantive arguments. It wasn't personal attacks. They were about their records. And so, talking about, Tim Scott being in the Senate for 12 years, what do you have to show for it? Talking about fracking and Ron DeSantis, um, I think she overall had a better debate performance because she offered a solution to Americans, whereas I think for a lot of other folks watching on the debate stage, it was more squabbles and fighting, and it was very clear that they were trying to get their 2 cents in. I think if you're trying to talk about a general performance, not looking at substance, I agree with John. I think Tim and Ron did have a better night because they spoke up more. To John's point, uh, they were forgettable during the first debate, and you had to remind yourself that the governor of Florida and a United States senator from South Carolina were on that debate stage. They tried to force themselves into the conversation, and at times it came across as awkward. But I mean, you gotta say that they did try to make themselves more present this time around. Same with Doug Burgum, definitely tried to insert himself into the conversation more. But whether or not it played well, I'm gonna have to say no on that front.
Representative.
Sorry, I might be having some technical issues here, but I'm assuming you queued me up. So I have to once again validate Preya's bias by agreeing in large part with her analysis of Nikki Haley. I felt as though Nikki Haley did a very good job of solidifying her lane. And that, in my view, is kind of I'll unpack this a little bit, but like the McDonald's Republican. And what I mean by that is when you go to McDonald's, no matter what city you're in, no matter what state you're in, you know what you're getting, you know what it tastes like, you know what to expect. And I feel as though kind of the conventional, well-worn, what a Republican looks like and sounds like in your head lane was very well dominated by Nikki Haley last night, to the expense of, or at the expense of, other candidates who are vying for that spotlight, whether you're talking about Tim Scott or Mike Pence or Burgum or any of these guys. Haley is the one to beat in their lane. And especially with the efficiency with which she managed the clock and managed to get her points across in a very balanced and stern manner, and to handle herself opposite these guys who were coming at her without flinching was very impressive. I feel as though, we've talked a lot about the format and how this debate was managed and produced. And, I found myself wanting to hear from certain candidates more and wanting to hear from other candidates less. And Haley was certainly on the list of candidates. She's my candidate, or because I necessarily have any intention of voting for or supporting her, but because what she was saying was substantive and it represented a point of view that deserved to be heard on that stage. Whereas a lot of the candidates like a Tim Scott or Mike Pence, the things that they were saying were, basically Hallmark card platitudes that I could get from anybody on the street. I don't need Tim Scott to sit there and take up debate time on a Fox News stage telling me those things. And so I think we're at the point here where whenever we have another debate, to Michael's point earlier, we need to have fewer candidates on stage. We need to focus on the people who are bringing a unique and substantive perspective to the issues. Nikki Haley's on that list. Ron DeSantis is on that list. You might not all agree with me that Vivek's on that list, but it's a very short list at this point. Donald Trump and those three out of tonight or last night are really the only ones who I'm interested in hearing more from.
Michael, your insights from the night.
I think the Nikki Haley Tim Scott dynamic is going to be very interesting, and I think that it would be interesting. I think that's going to be a narrative coming out of this debate a bit. I put Nikki Haley far ahead of Tim Scott, but they certainly had a dynamic between the two of them that I think Tim Scott will benefit from. So if I do think that there is a candidate that gained ground, did good, Tim Scott is one of them. Again, but I think like the first debate, what we're talking most about today is the performance of Nikki Haley. And I think independent of what we're saying, I think it's what the general narrative is out there is that Nikki Haley had a good night. I think it's always in the shadow of where the placement is in the race with Donald Trump. And I think if there's ever an opportunity for Nikki Haley to appear on a debate stage with Donald Trump prior to the Republican nomination, and getting one or two other candidates on there, I think would be an incredibly interesting situation. I don't know if that's going to happen, but just to sum up again, I think Nikki Haley, Tim Scott are candidates that I think folks are talking about today. And I certainly, as I was watching the debate, particularly after the first one, I remember this discussion, and I think it was John Rouleau who said in our analysis in the first debate, he brought up Tim Scott. And I think I remember saying I had forgotten that there was a United States Senator, Tim Scott, was on the stage. This time, at least, there's much more awareness about his presence on the stage. He was much more engaged in the discussion. And I think that shows by the fact that we're talking about him today. And so I think from that standpoint, I think his candidacy went up a bit, but I would still give Haley the one I think who did the best and gained ground.
I would have to say I think Scott and DeSantis both outperformed their first performance. In particular, one line that I wrote down was on the childcare question. Scott had an answer that really resonated with me, and again, I talk about it a lot, but I think Republican or suburban women are a big target, and so anytime we can make some inroads there. He had mentioned that more parents having more resources to make decisions for their family is what Republicans want to stand behind when it comes to childcare and childcare costs. And then we had this, an offshoot here, but Vivek then came in and turned it into a question and a rant about the American dream, which was a big frustration that I'll come back to later. But I think Scott had some standout moments that were very genuine. I think he is a genuine candidate, and I think that came across a little bit more. And I think he showed that he has the ability and the fire to fight a little bit, and I think that was a need. DeSantis, I think I was underwhelmed with his performance in the first one, and I think this time he came out a little bit more of the DeSantis that we've expected to see from him. So I think there's a lot of agreement there. And if we switch to who lost ground, as we know, with the good comes the bad. So another lap around, who, if anybody, lost ground after last night's debate. We are going to start with Preya this time.
So I think for the similar reasons that I said, Tim Scott and Ron DeSantis gained ground for showing up and actually reminding folks that they're on the debate stage. I think that they lose ground because when it came to the substantive answers that they offered, it wasn't there. And I think there are a couple of instances that we can point to. So, Tim Scott was asked to, tell Nikki Haley why he should be president over her. And, he tried to go after her for, his big line was about a debunked New York Times piece over curtains that Obama bought years ago, tried to attack her for that. Even though the New York Times and Vanity Fair and every other mainstream outlet had to retract that story because it had nothing to do with Nikki Haley whatsoever. I think if you're going to take a shot, especially if it's your first shot off the bow, at an opponent like Nikki Haley, especially someone that you largely in part have to thank for your career because she did appoint him to the U.S. Senate, but also has been a friend for a very long time. You got to make sure your shot lands. And the fact that that was the only thing that he could come at her with and then have it fail on top of that, I think that shows that he just wasn't necessarily ready for that question, and definitely wasn't ready to have that conversation. And that just further, begs the question, if you can't take on, the governor you've been friends with for how many years, can you take on Donald Trump or Joe Biden? And I think for the same thing on Ron DeSantis' side, he did have these moments where he was able to break out and be a part of the conversation. But on two instances, he really kind of fell flat. And that was when Nikki Haley went after him over the fracking comments. He tried to say, you're lying, it's not true. Well, fact checks from last night showed that on his second day, he instituted an executive order to ban fracking in the state of Florida. And he has a congressional record that showed that he was not as friendly to fracking on that front. And I mean, you could have gone one step further if you wanted to and talk about how he is not a friend of farmers or the ethanol biofuels industry, because he makes no mention of that in his energy plan, or the fact that he's tried to get rid of year-round E15. I mean, that could have been a whole other segue that he could have gotten into last night, but he really fell flat when it came to talking about fracking oil and gas, where in reality that should have been a bigger hit for him to come back on. And I also thought the second thing that he fell flat on is the insurance question. They asked him about healthcare costs being twice as high in the state of Florida compared to everywhere else in the country. This is not an issue that is new for the state of Florida. It's not an issue that's new for DeSantis. He should have been able to have an answer right off the bat to how either he was solving the problem or was working to fix the problem. Which, again, with the supermajority in the state of Florida, he should have figured that out in the first 4 years. But again, another conversation for another time. But throughout the answer, he seemed to be searching and reaching and trying to work his way through that answer. And I think if you can't answer a question about that is affecting your state specifically, that you have control over to try and fix it, I think that was a down moment for him too, where Floridians are going to be looking back and being, like, yeah, this is what we've been struggling with. What have you been doing about it? So I think for those two reasons, he did lose some ground on the substantive side. And then again, Vivek, trying to join TikTok because Jake Paul, he had lunch with Jake Paul, an influencer who's definitely not going to be voting in a Republican primary and probably definitely not going to be voting in a Republican general election. I just think for all of the concerns that we have about China and their data mining of American teenagers, it just was not a good move on his part, and to double down on it, bad decision. And it's not going to play well with the primary caucus voters who are paying attention right now.
All right. Representative Hudson, you're up.
Yeah, so I would say that as a consequence of Nikki Haley having the performance that she did and doing as well as she did, it, as I had stated earlier, kind of shoved her competition in that lane out of the limelight. So Tim Scott, Mike Pence, Doug Burgum, these are guys who were not, they're trying to bring the same thing that she's bringing, but they're not doing it as well or with as much engagement or conviction, and therefore becoming completely redundant. Like, we don't need to hear from these guys if they're offer a perspective that's different and offer it in a way that's better or more effective than Nikki Haley is offering it. So I would say, by virtue of the fact that I have no interest in hearing from either or any of those guys again, they definitely lost ground. The other person who I think lost ground for a different reason was Vivek Ramaswamy. And I don't think he had a bad night per se, but I could definitely tell that he was off his game and he seemed a little off balance. And it's funny because people make fun of him. He was called Chat GPT by Chris Christie, who's also on my list of folks I don't need to hear from anymore, by the way. But that whole Chat GPT meme about Vivek, it's funny because there's a certain amount of truth to it, right? He really does seem to kind of cut and paste talking points into his delivery. And it as a result, it doesn't always come off as being authentic. And I think in the first debate, he was much more relaxed. I think the personality that rubbed people the wrong way, some people in that first debate, is actually his genuine personality. And so it's easier for him to act it out. And that this time around, it was a little bit more artificial because he was trying to play Mr. Nice Guy which is not his natural manner of operating. He's somebody who gets in there and tells you what he thinks and is uncensored and authentic. And so whenever he tries to script himself, reason, he was a little more off balance last night than he has been in the past, and probably lost a little bit of ground.
Well said. John, we'll move to you.
So I think Mike Pence had a much worse night last night than he did the first debate. His dad jokes fell flat. It was painful. He had his please clap moment where he would try and deliver these awkward jokes and nobody responded at all, and he just kind of stood there and didn't really know what to do. So I think he moved backwards. Chris Christie, I think, is another one of those who his lines were landing flat. I think he was playing for an audience of one, but I don't know how well the Donald Duck line worked. I think that there were better ways to go on that. And then I think the other people who moved backwards really are the Republican primary voters. You watched that debate last night. It was an absolute train wreck. Fox dropped the ball. But if you look at the bigger picture, right, everybody on that stage, if you add all of them up in these early states, they're 20 points behind Donald Trump. And there still was very, very little contrast with Donald Trump. And they got to find a way to get votes from the guy who's in the lead. Politics is an addition problem. And you've got to find a way to get more votes than the other person. And you can't do that by stealing the votes from everybody on that stage, because you still lose by 20 points. You've got to find a way to get votes from the front runner. You've got to drive him down, move his voters away from him. And frankly, if you can't move his voters away from him, then why the hell are you running? Because that's the only reason to run, is to win. If you're running to try and sell a book, or if you're running to try and start a company or get a speaking gig on CNN or Fox News or whatever it is, get out of the way. But for right now, if you can't figure out how to take votes from Donald Trump, get out of the race and admit that it's over. Because if you can't do that, you lose by 20 anyways.
Michael?
I would put the losers that I would say, the people who lost ground. Number one, Mike Pence. He's incredibly stiff. He makes Al Gore look, like he's just can move with. He makes Al Gore look vibrant and alive. Mike Pence is just stiff. The format, these debates with the multiple candidates on there, particularly with, I would argue, to be much stronger personalities than he has, creates the type of environment for Mike Pence to just be forgotten about very quickly. There's a clear evangelical lane. I don't think it's a substantive lane. I don't think it's a path to the nomination, but there is a clear section, a clear lane of activists inside the party in that evangelical lane. And Mike Pence is trying to appeal to them. And as John said, the dad jokes, the kind of stiffness, it's just not working for him. And also, to John's point about what the framework of this race is, Donald Trump is in the lead by a sizable amount. And I don't think, with his presence not being there on stage, with him not being there, I think it creates an environment where candidates have to simultaneously talk about themselves, but then talk about someone who isn't there. And it's difficult to have that one-sided conversation and not have that real-time contrast. And so Donald Trump has made, by not being on the stage, he has made it very difficult for there to be real-time compare and contrast of his record. And tactically, it's a decision that's, I think, playing to his advantage. Chris Christie is someone who I think needs to have more depth to his campaign, more than just being the anti-Trump guy. And I saw that again last night, that his jokes about Donald Trump, his poking of Trump, his speaking directly to Trump, that only works for so long. And not having Trump in the room engaging with him, I think makes that strategy less effective. Vivek, I think, to Representative Hudson's point, I think he was much more vibrant in the first debate, which was, somewhat bothersome, but he seemed to dial that back a bit in this debate. And I think if he stays true to himself, he's going to get more attention and more enthusiasm, as much as I don't think his candidacy resonates with me. Finally, someone who I thought lost ground simply because of the structure of the debate. And this is where I think the RNC and all debate people who are organizing these debates need to do a better job, is Doug Burgum. There just isn't, in the time frame that's allotted, when you have 3 hosts of the debate competing with the other candidates, a candidate like him is just going to get lost in the mix. And that's unfortunate. I don't want to take anything away from the governor of North Dakota, but the format just doesn't lend itself. And the dynamics of this race, particularly with Trump not being there, 3 hosts, and the number of candidates that are there, these aren't the Lincoln Douglas debates. And it's difficult for someone like that to get through. And so arguably, from his stylistic standpoint and how he presents himself, coupled with the format of the debate, I just think that there's not any credible claim that could be made that he gained ground or that he had any breakthrough moments or anything of substance that we're talking about related to his performance. Becky?
Yes. So I largely agree with both Pence and Christie. Too many rehearsed lines. Pence at the beginning, one of his that I literally wrote down was, Joe Biden doesn't belong on the picket line. He belongs in the unemployment line. And then there was that awkward pause. And he didn't get the response. And then he tried to come back from that. And that happened time and time again. I think it happened with Christie and the Donald Duck line. I think it happened with Pence and I've been sleeping with a teacher for 38 years, which I don't think he meant in the way it came across, but it came across, right? I mean, that was one of the number one things I saw on social media last night. So those two, you got to have some of those things in your pocket, but it has to come across authentically. And I think it just came across poorly for both Pence and Christie. Unfortunately, Christie's my guy. So that was unfortunate. And now I'm going to go on my rant real quick on Vivek. The childcare question, he was one of the 2 that got asked about childcare costs, 70,000 potentially childcare facilities going out of business. John and I have young children, and the cost of childcare is outstanding right now. And should 70,000 more close, I can only imagine. This is a topic that is a really awesome opportunity for Republicans to message to parents and parents across the country. I've said it before, Republicans are never going to be the compassionate party. We're not giving everything away for free. We're not, going out and being that helping hand to every single person, every single family, business, whatever it might be. But we do have compassion and we do have a way that we can speak to this. And I think I think Tim Scott did a really good job on that. But I think Vivek, he went completely off. He didn't even want to talk about childcare or parents. And maybe that's because he cannot relate. But as president, you need to find a way to step into that. And, you use the old, yesterday I talked to John and Sarah and they want to have a 3rd kid, but can't because childcare costs, and how sad it is that they can't add to their family. There's a way to show some of that compassion with the solution. And that really bothered me. I thought that Vivek pontificated the whole time. I thought he sounded arrogant. I thought he came across, he gave me the ick last night. I was really it was just nails on a chalkboard to me when he answered, because I don't think that, I think I don't remember who mentioned it, that was his personality, that we're coming to believe or see that this is who he is. He's not putting on a front. I guess I just maybe don't like who he is, or because it just really spurred me the wrong way. I think with some of his answers, it was a really loss of opportunity for Republicans. And that bothered me. As you can tell, that was my rant of the day that I was pretty fired up about last night. So with that, I think we've mentioned a couple key moments that we like, but I do want to have a time to focus on some of these key moments, good or bad. So due to timing, we're just a little under 20 minutes, or just about 20 minutes left here. I'm going to ask you guys to find 1 or maybe 2, either a moment that stands out here, a favorite line, biggest oops, general sad moment where you maybe got the ick from a candidate like I did. What was said and by who? Representative Hudson, I'm going to throw it to you first.
All right. So my favorite moment came from Vivek, and it's interesting because it kind of runs in contrast with the other things that we've been saying about him. I think we've all been critical of his performance last night, but this one particular moment is why he's still on my radar and why I still think he's someone who deserves to be heard from in this conversation going forward. And it was a moment when he pivoted to telling a story about some parents who he had met who had lost their son to a fentanyl overdose. And the circumstances were that the kid, as I recall, ordered a prescription drug for antidepressant, I believe it was, off of some social media platform. And unbeknownst to him, it was laced with fentanyl. And as a result, he overdosed and sadly passed away. And Vivek used that story to talk about not just one particular issue, not just fentanyl as such, but kind of a spectrum of issues that have and tied it back into the root cause of these social ills. And that is a lack of purpose and meaning and fulfillment. You might use the word pride that we have in ourselves as Americans. Like there's a real lack of aspiration and fulfillment and meaning and purpose in the lives of so many people right now in this country. And that plays itself out in the form of all of these different social problems that can even rise to the level of costing someone their life. I really appreciate that aspect of his candidacy, that he's bringing to the table kind of these root causes and therefore providing us the opportunity as Republicans to talk about the thing we're for, right? This is one of the common criticisms that certainly as an elected official, as a candidate, and as an activist, I'm used to hearing people complain about Republicans only being against stuff and not being for it. Well, this is something that we can be for. We're for meaning, fulfillment, purpose, vision, virtue, right? It almost becomes this borderline spiritual conversation. And I think when we go there, it gives us the opportunity to be compassionate, to talk about issues in a way that gets people nodding. Now, is Vivek the best messenger for that? Probably not, but he has the virtue of being one of the only taking the conversation in that direction. And I really appreciate that. And I wish that more candidates would follow in his lead.
John, your turn.
I think we've hit on the most painful moments of the debate, and it's got to be Pence and Christie with Donald Duck. Those really stuck out and jumped out to me. Best line of the night might go to the Trump campaign, who put out a statement right afterwards that said tonight's GOP debate was as boring and as inconsequential as the first debate. And that sums it up for me. It was really an inconsequential debate. It didn't change anything. I wasted 2 hours of my life. To quote Nikki Haley quoting Billy Madison, I award you no points. We are all dumber for having listened to that entire thing. And frankly, if I wasn't doing this analysis right now, I would have shut it off 5 minutes in. It was a absolute train wreck of a debate, and I wasted 2 hours of my life. And my condolences to the people who have wasted 45 minutes of their life listening to us talk about that debate, because that's the biggest loser of the night, is the debate and the people who had to sit there and watch it.
Oh, I love it. That is very great. Preya.
Well, I would love to mention the Billy Madison line, because that was pure gold from Nikki Haley. I actually think her best line of the night came from when she steered the direction back to talk about the government shutdown, where she simply said, if Congress doesn't pass a budget, they shouldn't get paid. No budget, no pay. And I think that resonates with a lot of people, because that is the conversation that's happening right now. There's so much uncertainty that is surrounding a potential government shutdown. What is going to happen to families, farmers who are no longer going to have access to USDA during harvest season, military families who might not be getting a check, seniors who have Social Security. There's just a lot of uncertainty around that right now. And I think it's been part of her brand to really call out both sides of the aisle when it comes to the reckless spending in Washington and our national debt. And so it really was just on brand for her to say, look, nobody should get paid if you can't do your job. And I think that resonated with a lot of people because internally they're like, well, if I don't do my job, I can't get paid. So why should they? And I think the loser of the night again goes back to Tim Scott's argument with Nikki Haley over the curtains, and it's not for the reason that you might think. I think it hurt his brand in the long term because Tim Scott has really fashioned himself as this man of faith, really leaned in on the Christian conservative messaging, really leaning in on his faith. A lot of his ads in Iowa have really been dedicated to his faith. In his relationship with Christ. And I think to have your first big hit, to have your first big attack be false, I think that sends a message that your brand is really not as concrete as you make it out to be. You're the man of faith that just lied on stage in front of millions of people about your opponent. How does that conflate? And I think that just really hurt his overall brand in the long run. These folks are talking about him, but they're not talking about him in a positive way.
Michael, what stood out to you?
I'm going to take a little bit of a different attack than Preya did with Tim Scott. I do think his statement that he had been discriminated against, but America is not fundamentally a racist nation, I think is going to spark a lot of discussion. I think Tim Scott also going after Ron DeSantis for the discussion on whether there were redeeming qualities in slavery, and kind of shut the door on that kind of conversation. I do think that there's going to be some discussion about Tim Scott in the aftermath of this debate. I don't believe that he poses any substantive threat to Nikki Haley's candidacy, but I do think there's going to be some discussion a lot more in the days after this debate about Tim Scott and some of the comments that he made, and not in a controversial sense, but just the discussion that I think the media and analysts are going to focus on. Unfortunately, I do agree with John about the debate. I watched it last night as homework for this live stream. Had we not been doing this, I would have shut it off because it just was not a good format. It didn't start well. I think probably the biggest blunder of the night was the moderator, Dana Perino, asking near the end for people to vote someone off the island. Look, this isn't MTV. This isn't Survivor. This isn't and I don't understand. It seemed to me, and I don't work on a campaign. I wasn't involved in the planning of the debate or just watching it from the cheap seats as I was. But I don't know, in a presidential debate, I got the sense that was kind of off the cuff. That was kind of a surprise of the candidates. And I just don't think that's a good move to surprise people on a live stage during a presidential debate. I think it was a blunder on her part. And I think the media sometimes, even conservative media sometimes, I think does too much to insert themselves in, or moderators do, into the debate. And I think aside from the candidates on the stage, that was a pretty sizable blunder on her part. And I just don't think Fox Business on the whole did a good job in structuring that debate and how they presented it. That's my response. Becky.
I have a dog that's barking, so I'm going to throw it back to you real quick, Michael.
Well, yes. So that's where I think the debate ended off with that question. Let's go around the horn here while Becky deals with an in-house emergency. Let's go around the horn here and talk about the next question, which is change of the state of the race. Where does anybody think that the second debate changed the state of the race in any way? Or even more broadly, has the state of the race changed in any other way since our first debates a month ago, since our first conversation in August? It's been roughly a month. I think it was August 23rd was the last debate. So we're almost exactly a month away. We'll start with Preya. Give us your take about where you think the race is today. Has it changed? Give us your take.
I absolutely think it has. I think we've gone from a place where Ron DeSantis was, the Republican savior to come in and be the guy to take on Donald Trump. I think he's now in the mix with everyone else. But I also think that the narrative has shifted as we've seen poll numbers rise for Nikki Haley in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. We've seen the 4 or 5 head-to-head matchup polls showing her consistently beating Joe Biden when everyone else is kind of statistically tied in the mix. I think that's changed the state of the race, but I think the big thing last night for me that really spoke to me that she is now considered the number two, has kind of risen into that place of where DeSantis was at, was the fact that the Trump campaign attacked her last night. And that is something that they have never done. They've been solely focused on making fun of Chris Christie for personal reasons, and they have focused on Ron DeSantis. But even then, it hasn't been really consistent. But last night they went after Nikki Haley and went after her pretty hard by trying to compare her to Hillary Clinton. And I think that, in my mind, is a sign that they see a new challenger on the rise in Nikki, but also the fact that Democrats were actively attacking her last night as well, and actively trying to go after her because the Biden brain trust thinks she is the candidate to beat. So I mean, there's a saying that if you're incurring wrath from folks, you're probably doing something right. So the fact that she's got both Donald Trump and Joe Biden's eyes and ears on her campaign and everything she's doing is a good sign for us. But I think it's the big signal that the race is changing.
Fair point. Sorry about that. The dog wants to go outside, so appreciate you guys. Representative Hudson, your thoughts on the ultimate state of the race at this time?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of touched on this point earlier when John pointed out that the Trump campaign's response to the debate was that it was largely inconsequential. I don't think that this debate is going to have any real impact on the state of the race whatsoever, other than perhaps to signal to donors that they need to start consolidating in whatever lane it is that they're supporting. And as stated previously, I believe that Nikki Haley has, with kind of one fell swoop, demonstrated that there's a whole bunch of other people on that stage that are not doing her lane as well as she can. And so if there is any impact, it'll probably be long term in terms of the money drying up for those candidates who are following in her coattails. But as far as where things land with the state of the race, Donald Trump being way out ahead, DeSantis being the most likely non-Trump candidate or contender, and Vivek trailing a distant third, as kind of a bizarre combination of Trump surrogate and agitator, bringing something completely different to the race. All of that is the same today as it was the day before last night.
Rouleau, John.
So I think the state of the race, I think Nikki Haley still is kind of in, fighting for that number two spot with Ron DeSantis. One interesting thing that had changed, I think, as I watched it last night, is there were actually some defenders of sending resources to Ukraine to continue their fight to defend Ukraine against Russia, which I think was fitting that they were at the Reagan Library, and we're talking about crippling Russia's military without shedding a single drop of American blood, without any boots on the ground, getting a pretty good bang for our buck to take out half of Putin's army. But crippling an ally of the CCP, stopping his attempt to try and rebuild the old USSR. And I think that was interesting to see because that's not where I've seen the rhetoric from the party lately. I've seen much more rhetoric against arming Ukraine, against sending them old surplus and stockpile munitions. So I think that was something to watch. And then the other thing that I'll be watching is kind of what continues from the Nikki Haley, Tim Scott kind of dust up. They both come from South Carolina, and South Carolina has a long history of being somewhat of a viper pit. They have a long history of operatives who are knife fighters. This is the home of Lee Atwater and Warren Tompkins, people like Terry Sullivan. And I think that fight could get nasty. But I think we saw Nikki Haley bring those sharp elbows last night. And my only criticism of that is that if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It seemed like she was maybe a little bit more unfocused on where she was directing her ire last night. So I'll be curious if she kind of tightens that up and refocuses, because if you're fighting everybody, all that we're hearing is that you're fighting. And I think that she has a really strong message with a vision and a good grasp on policy prescriptions. So I think it would be a mistake for her to go fully negative on the entire field and just go scorched earth. But that's South Carolina politics, and I'll be really curious how that plays out in the coming weeks. We've got, I think, 6 weeks before the next debate, and I believe that the standards for participation for the next one are a little bit stricter. So hopefully we start to see some narrowing of that field and start to see some consolidation. But until then, Donald Trump still has a commanding lead, and somebody's got to do something to stop it if they want to.
Michael, bring it home for us.
I don't think there's any substantive change in the state of the race. I think Donald Trump is still in the lead. I do believe that Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis are still jockeying for the number 2 spot. I would clearly give the advantage to Nikki Haley. I don't see that Ron DeSantis is getting a ton of momentum in these debates and in the discussion point. And so I don't believe there's a substantive change in the state of the race. I'll be curious as we get towards the next debate. I don't have any expectation that Trump will be there. I don't see that there's any reason that he should abandon his strategy of just not engaging the Republican candidates on the same debate stage. It would be beneficial to the party process, I believe he did. But from a tactical standpoint, from a campaign standpoint, I don't think that there's any benefit that he does that. And so ultimately, I think that where we are today is where we were where we were 24 hours ago, and probably where we'll be a month from now, 6 weeks from now, which is that Donald Trump still has a sizable lead over his fellow Republican candidates, and it's going to be jockeying for number 2. And as of right now, I'd give the inside track that Nikki Haley is going to be considered the clear alternative in this race to Donald Trump. But that's where I see things. Becky.
I don't have a lot to add based on what you all already covered on this topic. One thing I did see, I personally thought, and then saw a couple folks also articulate on Twitter, is the surprising fact that this debate was held at the Reagan Library and very few mentions of Ronald Reagan came through, which used to be a mainstay in almost any and all Republican speeches, debates. You typically, I feel like 10 years ago, especially at the Reagan Library, we would have heard it, a dozen plus times from these candidates. So mine is less about the state of this race and more about the state of the Republican Party right now. I do think that we're all aware that we're a little lost right now. And I think that was just a kind of surprising thing for me that I would have answered in the previous one if I didn't have a dog that was barking up a storm. So I think the debate or the race itself, Trump is in first. We're going to hopefully see a few additional folks drop out here sooner than later. But it was a rough 2 hours. I think we all agree. I really appreciate all of you for sticking it through to come here and chat about it. Who knows where we're going to go? But real quick before closing, I want to throw it back to my illustrious co-host.
I just wanted to say thank you for everyone for, first of all, watching the debate. It's clear that it wasn't on the top of anyone's list, besides for maybe Preya, who needed to watch it. I don't think it was on anyone's kind of Wednesday night must do. But I just want to thank you guys for doing this. And I would like to just say on air, want to put you on the spot, and hopefully we can do this one more time after the next debate that happens. And the reason why we want to do it is because it's good to get kind of the evolution, and for people that listen to these episodes, get an evolution of your guys' thought process as how the race is evolving. So we hope to do this again for the next debate. And I just want to say again to Becky and to everyone, thank you so much for participating. Becky, for leading this discussion, and the rest of you for participating. I find myself finding the more we do this podcast, the less I have to say, because the guests, I enjoy listening to the guests and their analysis and commentary. And I did that very much today again. So thank you all, and appreciate your time and making yourself available to do this. Becky.
Yes, and so just in closing, I think if we're going to convince you guys to come back for a third time, we might have to send some goodie bags or some sort of bribe to your homes to convince you to put yourself through this pain yet again. But we're really appreciative. So thank you all for joining us for a second live recording of the Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Thank you for everyone who is watching us live or after the fact, wherever you are watching or listening. We want to thank you for the support for the Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Before we go, be sure to jump over to the platform wherever you listen to this podcast and give us a review. You can also leave a review on our website at bbreakpod.com. You can find us at Twitter at bbreakpod, and the Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will return next week. Thanks all.